Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us to our first Ask Me Anything Immigrant Refugee Live video series. My name is Cathryn Miller-Wilson. I'm the Executive Director of HIAS Pennsylvania, a nonprofit whose mission is to provide legal and social services to immigrants and refugees. Today, our conversation will focus on who are the asylum seekers at the border. Thanks to everybody who has submitted questions already. We are excited for our conversation today. If you haven't already done so, please submit any questions you have during the next half hour in the comments section below. If we don't get to them during this live conversation, we'll answer them afterwards. We would love to hear your ideas and topics for future videos. We hope that through this video series, you can ask any questions you have and learn the truth about immigration and refugee resettlement in the U.S. So today, we're excited to be speaking with HIAS Pennsylvania Senior Staff Attorney Ayodele Gansallo. Ayo recently spent a week in the Tijuana border volunteering with Al Otro Lado, an organization that provides Know Your Rights information to those arriving at the border and seeking to enter the United States to claim asylum. She's been an immigration attorney at HIAS Pennsylvania for over 20 years, helping hundreds of individuals claim asylum, including at the appellate court level. She also manages HIAS Pennsylvania's pro bono asylum lawyers. So I'm going to start with my own question. The president recently declared a national emergency at the border. What's happening at the border? What's changed from in the past?
So to get to your first question, what's happening at the border? You still have people who are coming to the United States, or at least trying to come to the United States. And essentially what is happening is that there is a process that prevents them from just arriving. These are the people that are presenting themselves to immigration officers, customs and border protection officers at the border. So instead of being allowed in and being processed in the way that they had been 2 years ago, the government has now instituted a process so that there is a limit on the number of people that can come in each day. So basically it's this filtering process. And the filtering process really is the process that is creating the problems that everybody talks about when they talk about a crisis at the border. There are many people that are trying to come to the United States to seek protection. That is not new. That is something that has been going on for a number of years, and the US government has been able to process them in the past. And what had been happening was that people who were coming to the United States would be detained until they were processed. They have to go through what is called a credible fear interview, which means that they have to establish to a minimum standard that they meet the criteria for asylum. And once they meet that minimum standard, they will then go on to have their cases heard in full by an immigration judge who will determine whether or not the person meets the criteria for protection. So once a person met the minimum standard in terms of the credible fear interview, they were then being released to sponsors or to family members who would then help them to navigate the system so that they could have their claims fully heard. And most of the people that were being released on a form of monitoring. There are many different ways that the Immigration Service can keep an eye on people that are being released. And so one of the methods is to use an ankle bracelet, which has a GPS monitor. In addition to the ankle bracelet, there are actually spot checks that the government contracts with different companies to do spot checks to make sure that people have not tried to abscond, that they're appearing at their immigration hearings. Every time somebody goes for an immigration hearing, they then have to do a check-in to let the people that are monitoring them know what's going to happen or what's happened in their immigration case. So there is this whole system that allows people to be processed and to go through the immigration proceedings and to make sure that they appear for their hearing. And the cost of that system is between $5 to $17 a day. But instead, this administration has made the deliberate decision that rather than releasing people and making space for more people to come in, they are going to detain people And that's when you then get the bottleneck that we have right now. And this is what is the issue at the border. And it should be known that there is a vast difference in cost in terms of detaining people. The government is required, or immigration is required to have at least 34,000 beds a day available. And that is at a cost of up to $208 per bed per day. Wow. And so if you think about the change in policy from releasing people, and you're talking about a 95% rate of appearance at their immigration hearings, to detaining all people, that severely restricts the number of people that can be processed. Mm-hmm. And so what you have at the border is you have people that are trying to get to the United States to be able to present themselves so that they can claim asylum and have an immigration judge decide whether or not they stay or they have to leave. And so actually the pressures are not on the US side, but actually on the Mexican side, because people who are waiting their turn to be processed have to then figure out how they remain in Mexico at their own expense. And so this is putting a lot of pressure on the Mexican side as opposed to the American side. So when there is conversation around national emergency, I mean, certainly what I saw in Tijuana I would not describe as an emergency. But then again, even if you were to use that language, I think you have to ask yourself, well, how is that emergency created? So how did we get here, basically?
Right. And so, in other words, also, how do we solve for it? You can solve for it by going back to the way that it was before, where there was,
that is
in
a
fact,
method, which
no
is significantly
filtering.
cheaper.
Right.
But you know, if you make policy decisions, mm-hmm. you kind of stick your neck out and you have to follow through, right?
Right. Okay, so so let me ask you, kind of backing up from that, some more basic questions. Can you explain to our audience what claiming asylum means, who can claim it, and under what circumstances?
So when you are claiming asylum, you're essentially saying that you're afraid to return to your country of nationality or the place that you had last been living. And when you make that declaration, you are only eligible for asylum if the reason for that fear comes out of one of 5 grounds. We call them the enumerated grounds. So you have to establish that you are afraid to return because of your race, your nationality, your religious views, your political views, or because you're a member of a particular social group. The problem in terms of immigration is with that last category, right? The particular social group, because that is the area that is the most litigated, because it does not have within the statute a specific definition. And so it is defined through cases. The judges giving us guidance as to what they think particular social group means. So just to take a step back, when we look at asylum law, we are looking at a law that has been established through international agreements. And the law of asylum came out of the atrocities in the Second World War with respect to genocide of the Jews, the Holocaust. And so the international community basically said, okay, we will not let this happen again, and so therefore we have to have a process where people can be screened to make a determination as to whether or not they should be given protection, given asylum. And so that's how you have this framework, which has now been enshrined into US law in the Immigration and Nationality Act. And what is important for people to understand is that the statute is very clear in stating who is eligible for asylum. Whether they came here lawfully, whether they came here as a visitor and overstayed, whether they came as a visitor and didn't overstay, whether they came into the country surreptitiously, it doesn't matter for the asylum process. They are still entitled to be assessed as to whether or not they meet the criteria for protection.
And again, just to reinforce the point that you made, it's because that law grew out of this experience in World War II where Jews attempted to come and were turned away and killed.
Right. And I think that that's why we need to make sure that we are protecting this law and making sure that it is available to people, because to know that you have this process and you are not allowing people to be judged through this process, people who could be returned to countries where they may lose their lives, I think that that's a serious responsibility.
Okay, great. So I want to get to a Facebook viewer's question. Karine Tassana, who read a statement in your border diary, she quoted your diary. It's widely known that U.S. Customs and Border Protection officers routinely divest owners of the most precious documents that serve as evidence of their lives. So her question is, what is the process for non-citizens seeking asylum, and how are U.S. Customs officials able to take away ID papers without consequences?
So I'm not sure that I would say without consequences, but so when somebody presents themselves to a Customs and Border Protection officer as someone seeking asylum, there is a process, and I need to be clear here that the actual process, it is not one that has been disclosed by the Customs and Border Protection. This is all anecdotal information. So, anecdotal, but we also know that everything that the applicant brings with them is taken from them, except for a layer of clothing, right? So they'll keep their clothing. They're kept in a detention facility that is kept at fairly low temperatures. So the documents that they have, the government takes those documents away from them, and they are supposed to create a file, and so the documents will remain on the government's file. The applicant will not have access to that file. The government has their documents. And so if you are trying to reach someone, or if you're trying to prove some aspect of who you are, and you had brought that with you, you no longer have access to it because it's with the government. And so that's really what that is saying. The process of getting those documents back can be cumbersome, but if you think about it, for someone who is granted asylum, there is a way for the attorney who may have helped that person to go back to the government attorneys by this stage, because the file would have been turned over to government attorneys, and to make a formal request for the documents to be returned. Now, whether you're getting the same documents as the ones that you submitted depends on how carefully the government has been in terms of having these documents follow you around, because somebody may arrive at Tijuana, but they won't necessarily stay there, right? Once they've been processed, if they're going to be detained, they may be sent to Lumpkin, Georgia, or to Burke's Family Shelter, or anywhere around the country. It's just it's completely arbitrary. It just depends on where there is a bed available, and that's where you get sent at that point. And so hopefully your file, there's a way of tracking your file so that it remains with you, and so all of those documents will eventually be available to you, but when you need them most, you don't have access to them.
Okay, thank you. And I just want to also clarify, because you referred to the fact that people's lawyers can sometimes ask for it, but that of course assumes that they have a lawyer.
This is
right.
For those who have lawyers, and many people, especially those in detention, do not have legal representation.
So people in detention, do they have a right to an attorney even though they're incarcerated?
So everybody who is in immigration proceedings has a right to an attorney, but they don't have that right in the same way that somebody in the criminal justice system would, because the criminal justice system says you have a right to attorney, and if you can't afford one, we will appoint one for you. So basically, in immigration law, you have a right to attorney if you can afford one.
And if you can't?
And if you can't, then you're representing yourself
Okay.
in a system that is already complicated. And so you're being required to navigate something that is difficult for me as a lawyer, right?
Right.
So.
And so getting back to a nice segue into the next question from a viewer. So you had talked about the fact that the file of papers is supposed to follow you, assuming that the record keeping was accurate, but that's a big assumption. And of course, we've seen that that's a big assumption with respect to the children that were separated this summer, right? I mean, the government didn't keep track of those children.
Well, so if we look at it, if we do the comparison, right? You're not going to keep track of children so that you can make sure that you reunite them with the right family member. So if you're not going to take the time to do that for human beings, why are you even going to bother about that for paperwork, right? From their perspective.
Right. And so this listener says, will efforts be made to prioritize uniting children with a family member? So talking again about the separated children that we saw this summer. Are you aware of efforts being made to prioritize uniting children with a family member?
So I think it depends on what you mean by prioritize that. I mean, through litigation that is ongoing, there are efforts to reunite the remaining children that have been separated. Unfortunately, the government keeps bringing up these various reasons as to why these children cannot be reunited. It turns out that the separation of children continues even till through this month. And when we were at the border working with Ayodele, one of the things that we were doing was getting people who were about to cross over the border to get them to complete a statement, a declaration to say they did not want to be separated from their children, and it sort of gave names of the family member and the children's names as well. How effective that declaration is, I have no idea. But it was one of the many things that Ayodele was doing to try to limit the reach of the government in terms of disrupting people's lives.
So I'm curious, you mentioned they are still separating children. How are they doing that, given that it was, the president declared that they would stop doing that?
So, again, it's about how you classify the need to continue doing it, right? So what the government is saying is that they are separating children from people who have criminal proceedings. So we know that people who actually do manage to make it into the United States illegally are being prosecuted through federal criminal proceedings. So I would imagine that in those situations, the government will say, well, we're putting you into federal jail while we prosecute you for illegally entering the United States. And, you have a child, so we are going to put this child into some separate facility.
Which, of course, now we must do because you have been criminally charged.
Yes, exactly. Yes. So.
Okay. And that is a change from the past, meaning 5 years ago or 6 years ago.
So the prior administration was not criminally prosecuting people who entered the United States unlawfully. I can't say that they weren't separating children from their parents, but they did it discriminatingly and certainly not on the scale that we saw last summer. So.
Or even today, if they're criminally prosecuting.
Right. Yes.
Okay, and so I guess I appreciate all that you've shared. So now I want to know, what's the most memorable asylum case you've ever taken? And there's so many. There's probably not one.
Yes, that's true. I would say I would classify it probably as the one that affected me the most. And this was one that I dealt with, I can't even remember when, but it was actually a Liberian asylum case, and this was during the civil war that was occurring in Liberia that was tearing the country apart. And it was dealing with a woman who had basically she had just suffered very much during the war, which was, there was a level of ethnic cleansing during that time as well. But she, part of her story, and I'm only going to tell you part of it because it was just so horrendous, was that she had been one of the tools of one of the weapons that the various factions was using was to rape women. So she had already been raped, and she was pregnant with a rebel or government soldier's child. I don't remember exactly. And then another faction came across her, and one of the things that they routinely did, and it's quite gruesome, is that they would basically cut the mother in order to bring out the child. It was a game that you would think that human beings being so horrendous, but they would pull out the child to see what sex the child was. Anyway, as you can imagine, this woman was so traumatized by her experience, and that wasn't all that she experienced, but that was just part of what she experienced. And so just getting her to trust me, to go through the process of telling her story, and helping her to tell the story, because obviously she didn't want to have to tell the story. It took, I would say, between the time that she would come to visit me and then she wouldn't come again, even though we had an appointment, and she would just disappear for months on end and then come back when she was ready. It probably took about 3 or 4 years to be able to just document what happened to her. This is actually a case that Carol Gantman, she did the psychological evaluation on the case. But because we were able to detail her story so clearly, it meant that when we then got into court with the immigration judge, he was very he and the trial attorney, actually, the government attorney, were very sympathetic to what happened to her. And she did not have to go through explaining again what had happened, because we already had it in writing. And so we were able to just really go through a minimum amount of evidence on the record, and she was granted asylum. So that's the most memorable, if you like, case for me. But I think of it more as the one that I can't really get out of my head. So.
Thank you for sharing that. It's very tough work. So I thought we'd end on a positive note. So if a lawyer wants to take on a pro bono asylum case with HIAS Pennsylvania, what should they do?
So we actually do encourage lawyers to take on cases on a pro bono basis, so you don't have to be an immigration attorney. And we offer training and mentoring. So we have just shifted to offering the training twice a year, from offering it just once. So the next training will be in June. We're just trying to firm up the date with our law firm partners. And so once that gets finalized, there will be advertising on the website and registration, so you'll be encouraged to sign up for that. We're particularly looking for attorneys that have language capacity, because that's the majority of people that come into us do not speak English. And at this point we're talking about definitely Spanish and also French. So if you have those capacities, certainly get in touch with us. And then once you've had the training, it's pretty much it's about a 5 to 6 hour training. And once you've had that training, you're then encouraged to take on a case. And while you're doing the case, you have mentoring that's available to you from HIAS, whether it's me or other attorneys that have done asylum cases. So it's a great way to learn.
Great. Okay. I think we're running out of time, so I want to thank you for all of those enlightening answers. If you, again, I just want to repeat, if you already sent in questions that we didn't get to answer, we'll answer them in the comments below this. And we hope you'll stay tuned for HIAS Pennsylvania's next Ask Me Anything Immigrant and Refugees, and learn more on how to support asylum seekers and other immigrants and refugees at our website, www.hiaspa.org. Thank you.
Thank you.